My name is Dr. Lee Moore, and this is Podcast Taiwan History, a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of the world's most fascinating island. We're brought to you by the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. Let's pick up where we left off last episode. Taiwan was a territory that had been under the control of the Qing Empire from 1683. It had just been ceded to Japan in the Treaty of Shimonoseki on April 17th, 1895. Japan invades, many in Taiwan resisted. About 14,000 people were killed in the invasion process. Some Taiwanese leaders briefly declared the Republic of Formosa, but that republic did not last. The Japanese Empire was just too powerful. They took over the island completely. Arguably, Taiwan is the first colony of Japan as it constructs its empire. Despite the initial resistance to Japan, colonialism in Taiwan involved much less violence than in Korea. The Taiwanese were much less dissatisfied with their colonial status when compared to places like Korea or later on places in China and other colonies that the Japanese had. The Koreans long resented their colonial status. In Taiwan, some folks resented it, but many felt quite positively about being a part of the Japanese Empire. When Japanese colonialism began, of course, most of Taiwan's residents spoke a Chinese language, usually Hoklo, sometimes called Minanyu or Taiwanese, and then an additional language that was spoken by 10 to 15% of the island's population is Hakka. Many of the ancestors of the residents of Taiwan had migrated to Taiwan from southern China a century or two before 1895. But politically, China's integration of Taiwan had been desultory. It was not until 1887 that Taiwan became a province in the Qing Empire. And for most of its colonization by the Qing, Taiwan was largely a peripheral site for those leaders in Beijing. That was part of the reason why they were so willing to give it up to Japan in the Treaty of Shimonoseki. None of this is to say that Japan's colonization of Taiwan was somehow benign. It was not. There were periods of extreme violence. In 1897, with Japanese colonialism still settling in, Japanese teachers were massacred and tortured. Their bodies were mutilated. This is in Shilin. Today, that's a suburb just north of central Taipei with a famous night market. But back then, the region was a wilderness area with a small Hakka population. Japanese colonial forces responded with a brutal 6-week campaign of terror against the Hakka in this region, killing many people. Taiwan was effectively a military dictatorship run by the Japanese military. But in the 1920s, policies changed. In Taiwan, the Japanese government allowed for significantly more openness, even if this is only a brief period. Mostly during the period from around 1919 to 1937, Taiwan during this period was ruled by Japan, guided by a policy called the Doka policy. In Mandarin, that's just Tonghua, assimilation. Despite the name, the assimilation period, the Doka period, Taiwan was actually fairly free to develop on its own. Many in Taiwan were encouraged to learn Japanese. In fact, learning Japanese became de rigueur for those who wanted to advance their careers. It was the lingua franca on the island. The elites, both those Japanese colonizers and Taiwanese people who wanted to be members of the elite, all had to learn Japanese. Most of the authors and poets before 1945 in Taiwan were writing in Japanese, no matter what their ethnic heritage. Japanese became the main language. Chinese languages are still being spoken on the island during the period before 1945. So in your home, you would speak Hoklo or Hakka, and there were a few people at times advocating for the speaking of what is today known as Mandarin, though these were very, very few and far between. Mandarin has no roots in Taiwan. It's an invented language based in northern China. Almost no one in Taiwan would have had any reason to speak Mandarin. So instead, they learned Japanese. That said, Taiwan's people during this period were allowed quite a large amount of freedom. There was a move towards more self-government, so the colonial government led by the Japanese offered a bit more space to the Taiwanese. Increasingly, the Taiwanese were empowered by the Japanese colonial leaders to rule themselves and to self-govern. But by 1937, as the empire was knee-deep in a war in the Asian mainland and chugging towards war with the United States and much of the rest of the world, the Japanese colonialists were increasing their suppression of Taiwanese forms of expression. This policy was called Kominka. In Chinese, it's Huangminghua. Just literally means something like imperialization became the policy that essentially forced Japaneseification onto the population of Taiwan, out with the Doka period policies where the Taiwanese were allowed to self-govern. In was new policy that foisted Japaneseification onto the population. In 1937, Taiwan's Japanese colonial government forbade the use of any Chinese language in most contexts. Taiwan was closely linked to Japan. Many of the brightest students were educated speaking Japanese. Often the best would travel to Tokyo or Osaka or Kyoto to finish their college education, though at home they might continue speaking Hoklo or Hakka or whatever language they spoke at home. Most of the reading that Taiwanese intellectuals did was in Japanese literature. It seems strange to folks who are less familiar with Taiwan's history, but most of what qualifies as Taiwanese literature that's published before 1945 was not written in Chinese, but instead in Japanese. The most important novel during this colonial period, Wu Zhuo Liu's Orphans of Asia. We'll talk about this more in an upcoming episode of the podcast when we discuss Wu. But the reason this book is relevant to our discussion now is that though this is the most important novel in pre-1945 Taiwan, it was written in Japanese. This really gets to the heart of the most important question about Taiwan today. Is Taiwan Chinese? The famous question that Brown, a scholar at Harvard, wrote a book titled, Is Taiwan Chinese? But Professor Brown is not the only one who is asking this question. It's the question hanging on the lips of nearly everyone in Washington, D.C., Taipei, and Beijing. It's a question over which people are willing to fight wars. The fact that one of Taiwan's most important novels, arguably the most important Taiwanese novel in the history of Taiwan before 1945, was published not in Chinese, but in Japanese, shows you just how complicated the question is. It shows you that Taiwan's history is quite distinct from that of China's. That's not to offer an answer to that question, but just to say it is in this period of Japanese colonialism which Taiwan gets this distinct political, cultural history. Okay, so Taiwan becomes a Japanese colony in 1895, but anybody who knows anything about world history knows 1945 is the year when everything changes. That is true in Taiwan as much as it is true anywhere else. In 1945, the Japanese Empire found itself smashed on America's atomic weaponry. Japan surrendered to the U.S. and the other Allied powers. Officially, these Allied powers included the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi in Mandarin. Troops from the Republic of China took control of Taiwan from the Japanese in late 1945. To understand what happened next, we have to rewind a bit. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of China. He headed a party called the KMT. For his philosophy, Chiang Kai-shek drew both off of American democratic notions of power, but also fascism. His fascism drew on a version of Chinese nationalism. He considered at one point working with the Nazis, but the Nazis would not work with Chiang Kai-shek. So in the end, Chiang Kai-shek threw in his lot with America and the Allies. It turned out this was a good thing for Chiang because he, in the end, had to side with the winners of the wars that ended in 1945. One of the things that Chiang Kai-shek demanded as the Allies were winning the war. He wanted the Allies to force the defeated Japanese Empire to return Taiwan to China. And so when Japan surrendered, Taiwan, after 50 years of being part of the Japanese Empire, shifted back into the control of China and to the KMT. There were tensions apparent almost immediately. Many of the Chinese who were taking control of Taiwan thought that though Taiwan was part of China, the Taiwanese had somehow betrayed their homeland by working with the Japanese. Of course, there's a problem to this logic. It was the Qing Empire that had given Taiwan away. Many in Taiwan had initially resisted, but when Chinese folks blamed Taiwanese for collaborating with Japan, oftentimes they forgot this very important fact. On the other side, many of the Taiwanese looked on the Chinese coming to take control of Taiwan with a similar attitude of disdain. First off, the Taiwanese resented being blamed for betraying China when it was Beijing that had given Taiwan to Japan, something that the Taiwanese had no say in. Furthermore, many Taiwanese looked down on the Chinese coming to take control of them. They saw these Chinese mainland soldiers largely as poor hicks. They were oftentimes from very rural areas. They didn't understand how modern infrastructure worked. For all the problems of Japanese colonialism, at least the Japanese colonialists had developed Taiwan economically far beyond almost any place in China. And when the KMT came to Taiwan, they often looked like rubes. One scholar tells a story of a Chinese soldier. He did not understand how faucets and water pipes worked. He buys a faucet, he sticks it into a random point in the wall, not a point connected to any kind of water pipe, just some random point in the wall, and then he gets angry when the faucet does not give him water. These are the kinds of stories that circulated amongst the Taiwanese people as you have these Chinese folks coming to Taiwan to take control of the island. And I have to have a side note here to discuss terminology. The people who came from China to Taiwan after 1945, in Chinese, they're usually referred to as 外省人, people from outside the province of Taiwan. The ethnically Han Chinese people whose families had lived in Taiwan for generations before 1945 are called Banturen, the people of this land. For the purposes of this podcast, to make sure it's not too confusing for your average English-speaking listener, I'm going to refer to the 外省人, the people who came to Taiwan after 1945, simply as Chinese, as most of them still identified as Chinese. I'll refer to the Banturen, the people whose family had come to Taiwan from mainland China centuries before. I'll simply refer to them as Taiwanese or native Taiwanese, just to make things simple. Okay, back to the main narrative of history. You have these two sides. Chinese folks are coming, taking over Taiwan. They think the Taiwanese betrayed the motherland. The Taiwanese equally are not happy about the Chinese, these rubes, coming to take control of their country. This tension boils over on February 28th, 1947. A woman selling cigarettes illegally without paying taxes in Taipei. She gets accosted by the police working for the KMT. They pistol whip her. It's not clear to the folks on the scene if she dies at this point. Some people think she does, although she did not, in the end, die. Soon, local Taiwanese people begin to riot against the police. These riots grow, and within a few days, the KMT forces who had once been able to control Taiwan had lost control. Local Taiwanese people were angry at the KMT for the manner in which the KMT had treated the locals. Chiang Kai-shek sends more military forces to Taiwan. When they arrive, they engage in a wholesale slaughter of Taiwan's population. This included random acts of violence throughout the island, but also a targeted campaign going after Taiwan's intellectuals with the intent to weaken any sense of Taiwanese identity. 18,000 to 20,000 Taiwanese people were slaughtered in what became known as the 228 incident, this name referring to the date February 28th. This particular incident has been a touchstone in Taiwanese history, something that many in Taiwan point to as the moment when everything changed. But in fact, the reality is much more complicated than that. The 228 incident was just one point in a series of violent incidents that the Chinese KMT forces perpetrated in Taiwan as they took control of the island. This violence became both more of a problem but also more necessary because of what was going on back in China. Chiang Kai-shek had once been considered the ruler of all of China, but by 1949, his military failures had squandered all of that. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party took control of all of China, pushing Chiang and the rest of the KMT to retreat to Taiwan. The implications of this are that the KMT had to make sure that they would not be threatened in their last holdout. Taiwan was their fortress. If they lost there, they were done for. But it also meant that the KMT's troubled relationship with the Taiwanese population was going to be a problem. Initially, Chiang Kai-shek goes to Taiwan. He carries out a program that historians know as the White Terror. Anyone who threatened Chiang Kai-shek's control over Taiwan was either murdered or imprisoned, tortured. In this, 3,000 to 4,000 people were executed in a decades-long campaign of terror, and about 140,000 people were jailed. The White Terror is kind of an extension of what happened in the 228 incident. You can see them as separate, or you can kind of see them as just part of a continuum of violence that the KMT engaged in as Chiang Kai-shek tried to subdue Taiwan. The White Terror involved much fewer executions. The White Terror involved much more of jailing people who disagreed with Chiang Kai-shek and the ruling KMT. The people that they jailed included those native Taiwanese folks who wanted to ditch the KMT and its ideology of Chinese nationalism. But it also included anyone, whether Taiwanese or Chinese, who espoused leftist ideals. And there were a significant number of Chinese folks who came to Taiwan after 1945 and yet still were sympathetic to communist ideals. One of the most important of them being one of Taiwan's most famous writers and activists, Chen Yingzheng, who was jailed for about a decade for advocating for Marxism. That was a part of the White Terror. The White Terror lasted for several decades, but it was at its most intense during the 1950s. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was less ideological fervor in Taiwan, less anti-communist movement, and more focus on Taiwan's economy. This is the period when Taiwan took off economically. Taiwan became one of the four Asian tigers, alongside South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore. These were four capitalist economies aligned with the United States on the edge of Asia that boomed because they became the factories of the world during this period. With this economic boom, the focus on Chiang's dictatorial programs, particularly the White Terror, slackened, though they never actually ended. An era of terror always lingered over Taiwan until the advent of democracy in the late 1970s, early 1980s, depending on how you want to date it. Politically, until the late 1980s, Taiwan was not a free democratic country, but economically it was fairly free. The native Taiwanese people, many of those Taiwanese families who had been threatened by the White Terror, who had lost family members during the White Terror, they took on prominent roles in the business community, and often they would create these massive business empires. These are the foundations of Taiwan's economic success today. It starts right here in the 60s and the 70s. As we progress into the 1980s, that economic success is going to continue, but the big change is really going to be democratization. During the 1980s, Taiwan underwent democratization. The White Terror has ended. Taiwan During the latter part of the 1980s and into the 1990s, transitions from being a dictatorship led by the KMT into a democracy where the KMT and the DPP, a new political party, fought it out just like in a normal democracy. With the blossom of Taiwanese democracy, the country became much more open in other ways. Taiwan became a beacon of women's rights in Asia, gay rights in Asia. But let's turn to literature, since this podcast is focused on literature. I want to go back in time a little bit to 1946. Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT have arrived. The use of Japanese as a language was banned in this year, 1946, in a mirror kind of what happened in 1937 when the Japanese colonial forces banned the use of Chinese in most contexts. So many of Taiwan's intellectuals were fluent in Japanese, but not in Mandarin. This generation, the writers born and raised in Taiwan from this period, had to learn how to write in Chinese. Most of them had grown up, at least in educated settings, speaking Japanese, writing in Japanese. They were not fluent in Chinese. Many of them couldn't speak Mandarin, the language that the KMT brought with them, and very few of them could write in Chinese. Most of them, not all, but most had to learn a new language. Some scholars have called this the silent generation. That is the state of Taiwan's literature as the White Terror gripped the country. Taiwan's literature was very shallow and mostly focused on producing anti-communist dribble. During the 1950s, Taiwan literature was dominated by anti-communist literature, and mostly the people writing it were not native Taiwanese writers, because those writers are still trying to figure out this new language. They're still learning this new language. Most of the writers during this period are Chinese writers discussing their longing for going back home to China. Oftentimes, this literature is little more than propaganda. It's coming out of government-sponsored contests to write the best poem or write the best novel about defeating the communists and returning home to mainland China. Almost no one reads this literature because it's really, really bad. Here is an example. This is a poem by Zhong Lei. It's called Love for the Yellow River. It won first prize in one of these anti-communist literature contests in 1952. This translation is from Michelle Ye, an excellent professor of Chinese and comparative literature at UC Davis. Really a top-notch scholar. Here's her translation. Ah, yellow river, forever you flow endlessly day and night, so diligent and busy. And then Michelle Ye cuts to another part of the poem. In my golden childhood years, every day I leaned on your golden bosom. I drank your golden sandy milk and grew fast and stout. Yikes, this is some really crappy poetry. There's almost nothing to say in terms of aesthetics other than this is really bad. But as a historical artifact, this poem is interesting because you're having someone who in 1952 wins a contest in Taiwan, and it's all about the Yellow River, a river that doesn't get much closer than 800 miles from Taipei. Are you skeptical that this poetry is really as bad as I say it is? Maybe you're thinking, this poetry, it's not that bad. You don't have to trust me when I say that this poetry is bad. All you have to do is ask the poets themselves. There are lots of Taiwanese poets, Taiwanese writers publishing poetry in Taiwan. Those who did participate in these 1950s anti-communist literature contest usually left out those works when they were compiling their collective works later in their lives. So when they come up with their list of the best things they had ever written, they acknowledged that the stuff that they wrote in the 1950s for those anti-communist contests, not all that good. Mostly the reason these authors did this is just to get on the right side of government and to make sure that they were not victims of the White Terror. That was the 1950s. But in the 1960s, you actually have some interesting writing coming out of Taiwan. There's a new literary movement called Taiwanese modernism. In the slightly more free environment of the 1960s, you had Taiwanese authors exploring modernity in a Chinese/Taiwanese context. I say Chinese/Taiwanese. Those authors who identified with this Taiwanese modernist movement were generally born in China. They identified themselves as Chinese, not as Taiwanese, and they saw their modernism as a Chinese modernism, not Taiwanese. The two writers who best represent Chinese/Taiwanese modernism in literature are Wang Wenxing, who died just a few months ago in September 2023, and Bai Xianyong, who is still, at the moment I'm recording, still alive. These authors drew off modernism in the West, that is Joyce, Proust, other authors famous in the modern canon, but they tried to channel their own modernity into a Chinese-Taiwanese context. One criticism of the Taiwanese and Chinese modernists is that they were too slavishly mimicking Western forms of modernism. Also, critics allege that they are too disconnected with the Taiwan where they are writing. The fact that they saw themselves oftentimes as Chinese rather than Taiwanese signaled that they were disconnected from the Taiwanese situation in which they were writing. A personal story. I have seen Bai Xianyong speak twice in 2014. I saw him twice in that year. The first time I saw him speak, he was talking about Kunchu. Kunchu is a form of drama closely connected with the cities of Kunshan and Suzhou in Jiangsu, China. Bai Xianyong was talking about how sad it was that Taiwanese kids today do not know their heritage, particularly the Kunchu opera form. And I remember thinking, but how closely connected is Kunchu to Taiwan? Bai Xianyong's criticism of Taiwanese youth only works if you assume that Taiwan is part of China, which of course Bai Xianyong does. But that is something that many in Taiwan would push back against. After the Taiwanese modernist, you have another major literary movement. The next literary movement is a group of people who did push back against these notions. They pushed back against the modernist and their assumption that China and the West were models against which Taiwan literature should be measured. This group is called the nativist literature movement. 乡土文学运动. Taiwanese nativist writers believed that Taiwan's writers should take Taiwan as the starting point of literary production. Taiwanese customs, Taiwan's situation, this should be the beginning of all writing about Taiwan. The most representative author is Huang Chunming. We're going to discuss him more in a later episode of the podcast. He is the leader of this Taiwanese nativist literature movement. The nativist literature movement erupted onto the scene in 1977. Yu Guangzong publishes an essay in July that year called Lang Laila, The Wolf Comes, which some consider to be the starting point of the movement. Others suggest that the starting point happened a little earlier in 1977 with the publication of Ye Shitao's Taiwan Xiangtu Wenshui Daolun, an introduction to Taiwan's nativist literature. The Taiwanese nativist literature movement, along with Taiwanese modernism, these are the two most important literary movements to come out of Taiwan. After the nativist movement, and I don't know that the nativist movement has stopped. Depending on who you ask, you can think of Taiwanese nativist literature as still being produced today. But after Taiwanese nativism emerges, democratization happens. And increasingly, Taiwan literature is becoming one of the most interesting literatures in the postmodern world. What do I mean by postmodern? Postmodern is a literary philosophical movement that is characterized by the fracturing of identities. Under the KMT's dictatorial rule, one of the things that they did was they imposed a single identity on the Taiwanese people. The Taiwanese people were told, you're not allowed to think of yourself as Taiwanese. You can only identify as Chinese, nothing else. My PhD research is focused on museums in China and Taiwan. Taiwanese museums during this period were not allowed to use the word Taiwan because the Taiwanese people were not allowed to think of themselves as Taiwanese. Taiwan was not allowed to have an independent history. Taiwanese history was a part of Chinese history, and the only way you were allowed to discuss Taiwan's history was in reference to China. With the nativist literature movement and the corollary movements in history, politics, and thought, that taboo on using the word Taiwan, of thinking of Taiwan as an historical agent independent of China, all of that was broken. There was a debate from 1982 to 1984. This was one of the first times when in literature you had writers talking about Taiwan Wenshui, Taiwan literature. Before this, Taiwan literature was the literature that dare not speak its name. But with the nativist movement, you have this fracturing of identities. Once this dichotomy of Taiwan versus China, once that breaks down, other identities emerge. With the coming of democratization and the coming of Taiwanese nativist literature, you have other identities coming to the forefront. You have queer Taiwan literature. You have feminist Taiwan literature. In the 1990s and 2000s, Taiwan's literature becomes one of the most postmodern literatures in the world. Some of the most interesting and experimental literary thinking is being done in Taiwan. Despite that, it is largely ignored by the rest of the world because that work is not being done in a European language. No Nobel Prizes have gone to Taiwanese writers. One of the reasons is just because there is this tendency amongst the Nobel and other major literary prizes to ignore or discount writers who are not writing in English, French, German, or, well, since the prize is given out by the Swedish Academy, writers in Swedish too. One of the goals of this podcast is to try to address that problem. The goal of this podcast is to introduce the English-speaking world to Taiwan, its literature, its culture, its society, its history. The goal of this podcast is to get the wider world to recognize Taiwan's writers as fascinating literary experimenters who are dealing with some interesting problems and doing it in a way that few in the rest of the world are doing it. My hope is that in trying to talk about what they have done, win these Taiwanese writers some recognition and the Nobel Prizes that they deserve. All right, I'm going to stop here. In subsequent podcasts, I'm going to dive into some of those authors working in Taiwan who are doing fascinating experimental work and try and introduce you, the average listener who speaks English, who's not familiar with Taiwan. I'm going to try and introduce you to these writers. My name is Dr. Lee Moore. This is Podcast Taiwan, a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of the world's most fascinating island. Until next time, I'll say in Taiwanese, thanks for listening. 多谢